Right, hello everybody. We had an interesting little computer glitch. I think I talked for about half an hour without the microphone actually working. So I have to start part two, birds again. And here we are. Well, the reason I selected mammals is because we are mammals, and the reason I selected birds is because they can do something very, very unique. They fly. And that is not a trivial, matter. And it's actually an enormous evolutionary achievement. Another reason is, of course, I work on birds. I work on mammals, birds, fish, all the other things. But I like birds for the simple reason because they are so diverse and so fascinating. And of course, birds are quite clever. You can see those oyster catchers. I took that photo 2 weeks ago up on the news on the West Shore, and you can see that do perfect social distancing. They also do yoga in the morning, as you can see. That's from last week, and it's quite an interesting move. Maybe I should actually practice this. Never mind, birds are fascinating. And we're also in an incredibly cool part of the world. Ooh, look, he's getting me. Cool part of the world where essentially we can observe an astonishing variety of birds, some of them highly endangered and big. Now, some birds, we kind of take for granted, like a seagull eating a fish, but let's not forget, this is actually a part of the natural food webs and still quite fascinating. And I think some birds are actually quite cool. Look at this fella, he's sort of off to the pub, really needs a pint or two. And this one is sort of leaning that way. I don't know what they were doing, so it's a big commotion. Birds also have an enormous attraction to people, and that is an emotional attachment. And I had to learn this the hard way going to a bird conference where people had really, really very, very strong feelings about birds. And there's nothing wrong with that because if you want to have effective conservation, you also need effective measures to communicate that. And birds are an excellent vehicle for that. But what is really, really astonishing is the fact that you can actually have some birds who obtain food by hammering into a tree to get bugs out. Now, think about it. Quite weird. And then you have the other ones who go into the ocean and dive from a cliff down to catch a fish. Now, for me as an ecologist, to have that variety of ingenious ways and quite successful ways is just simply captivating. That's the word. And I hope it captivates you as well. Now, one cool thing about birds is that we have really, really good archaeological evidence. As a matter of fact, the archaeological evidence is really so excellent that we can seamlessly document a very tight, very close relationship between birds and reptiles. As a matter of fact, the birds evolved from reptiles, and technically speaking, any zoology versus his metal would actually call a bird a non-avian, an avian reptile, because basically, as my old friend Philip used to say, professor of zoology, well, they are just basically lizards in chicken suits, and that's what they are. And we know that because the archaeological record or the paleontological record shows us this is Archaeopteryx, and you can see they already developed feathers, they have claws, but they got reptilian skin scales, and most importantly, they got teeth. But over time, those features get lost, and those features really came out. And you might say, well, we discussed what makes a mammal, so what makes a bird? And it's all about flying, really. So essentially, the adaptations for flight are that the front appendages are modified for wings. And they can even fly in the water. Remember the pelicans I showed you, not the pelicans, the penguins. And the skin has feathers. Now, feathers are not, we take them for granted, but they're not quite trivial. They have an enormous high metabolic rate. They are endothermic animals, so they maintain a constant body temperature. They have a highly specialized skeleton modified for flight. very light bones with air spaces inside, but still very, very hard. That's why you should never actually feed your dog chicken bones. And they have horny bill and no teeth. But those are almost secondary characteristics. The primary characteristics are the ones above. Now, feathers. Now, we have used feathers as humans as ornamental objects, as objects to demonstrate status. We use them for, clothing and so forth. Actually, I use feathers when, back home in the house, but might show you some day, And a feather is actually a very, very cool anatomical structure. If you think about an aeroplane, it's basically an internal structure of larger aluminium, and there's aluminium skin riveted at the top. And what we actually have here, the primary feathers, the flight feathers, they have a shaft. Think about this as the wing going off from the fuselage. Then off from that main shaft, or the rachis, are smaller side branches, which we call the barbs. The barbs have barbels, which go off at an angle, and they have little hooks called the hemorrhoid. Don't worry about all these terms. And they interlock with the barbels, the smaller ones, from the neighboring barb. And eventually, this creates a very, very flexible but yet tightly interlocked system, useful and very resistant to air pressure. But below those flight feathers are kind of fluffy down feathers, where the barbs are actually small, there is no hooks, and they basically don't interlock. And there we go. You can always have props when you lecture from home. Here's a down jacket, nice and warm, and we basically use those because they're full of those down feathers. But birds have them naturally close to their skin, and that's why you can have a goose and a swan sitting on ice, literally on a frozen lake. We have plenty of them at home in Austria, and no problem at all. And here you can see how as those develop. There's a little pimple getting out from the epidermis. Then a blood vessel comes in, and around cinque scales form a collar. Then the blood vessel gets a little bit bigger, and the first structural elements form. It always sits in a follicle. There's a shaft, and eventually it breaks out and folds up. No big surprise there. Now the skeleton. I should really have bought a chicken or any other bird. I'm actually going up to the beach tomorrow, so I know where one is, like a dead one. The most astonishing thing for flight is you need big chest muscles. You need, basically I have a chicken breast, but only because I don't have many muscles, because you need to actually move those front limbs up and down to get airborne and stay airborne. Now, what is quite important is, once you do that, you need to maintain flight, so you need to be light, which is assured by, and also for takeoff, by having bones which are hollow in the inside, but not quite hollow. They have all sort of intricate little gross elements, but the main muscles are really here on the sternum. And when you eat chicken, you often have chicken breast, which are the two main pectoral muscles on the side. But remember, they're actually used to move the wings. And they're separated also for attachment to the skeleton by a very large sternum protruding as a keel. And now that keel is essentially the main attachment of the flight muscles to the rest of the bird. We don't actually have that because we walk on two legs. Remember what I just said in the earlier lecture. Now, flight is not a trivial matter, but also it has remarkable similarities with aircraft engineering. Look at this guy, taking off from a twin Tiva. Some brilliant photographer obviously took that. Very brilliant, I should say. And how does it actually work? That looks very complicated, but it isn't. Now the wings basically beat at an angle, right? And they are shaped as an airfoil. So that if you look at this eagle here, can we see it here? Yeah, we can see it here. There is a fat ridge, literally probably an inch or so at the front, and then it becomes very narrow. And this is in what we call an airfoil. So, and they also have the wings at an angle. It's called the angle of attack relative to a horizontal plane. It basically means the air flows over it fairly quickly, and it flows even quicker at the bottom. That means there is actually a lift being created there. Now, as you actually try to get bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of your lift, or higher and higher and higher, you pitch the wing a little bit steeper, and that actually starts to create turbulence. Now, how do you actually counteract that? Next time you go in an aircraft, look out the wing, and there's little winglets riveted on, and sometimes the wings even go up, and they're actually there to reduce turbulence. Now, birds have some, and they have flaps and so forth. Now, birds have something quite similar, or maybe actually copied it from them, and it's called an alula. Now, the alula is a pair of feathers on the middle digits, and they can actually be raised or lowered. So when the bird actually tries to take off, it has to raise them, and that's in the cross section here, to reduce the turbulence. But once you soar, you can actually put them down and you glide without resistance. Very, very clever. Now, the other thing about a bird is when you actually dissect a bird, and unfortunately we can't actually do that, we should really try to do that, maybe in a backyard in the field, is you have a large breastbone, you have the legs and so forth. But the internal anatomy, is filled with air. Not all of it, of course, but there's a lot more air volume than in any other vertebrate. Why is that? Well, this looks actually very, very complicated, but really it isn't. Essentially, flight requires a lot of energy. A lot of energy requires a high rate of metabolism, and a high rate of metabolism requires a large amount of oxygen to be transferred to the body. That means your ventilation system has to be extremely efficient. Now, when I breathe in and when I breathe out, or any of you, basically we can use our intercostal muscles to expand our chest, or we use our diaphragm. When you exhale, there remains a volume of air in your body, which is basically called dead air or stale air. Now, birds can't really afford that because they need to have fresh air flowing over their lungs all the time to feed that extraordinary high metabolism in flight. And hence to have this really intricate system. Think about a bagpipe. There is air sacs here, there is air sacs there, and they all ensure that there is a volume of air which can always flow over the lungs, even when you inhale or have a pause or so forth. Because essentially there's 2 cycles of inhalation and inspiration and 2 cycles of expiration. So birds have the most efficient gas exchange system of all animals which we know, and it's large and it's complex, but it ensures that as much oxygen as possible transfers from the air into the bird's muscle. Now, here's the thing: birds fly. Of course, they fly, but they fly astonishingly long ways. Now, here is an illustration. Up here is the top of Greenland, and here is North America. But some birds really go from South America all the way up and back. So it's literally the entire globe. Now, we actually don't have to sort of say, we don't have to use a textbook from the States. No, because we have it ourselves. Now, we work quite a bit on those kind of systems. And this is Tiva Beach in the north of Noosa. What a nice, image. I wonder who took it. It's called A Rhapsody in Pink. It's actually a single person. And when we go to this beach, we actually find lots of birds. That's cool. As a matter of fact, most people don't really realize how cool our system in Australia is to work on birds. And some of those birds do astonishing things. They basically go up to Siberia and they come back to Australia. Go up to Siberia, go back to Australia. And I do this because once you actually have been in the northern summer, there's insects everywhere. The tundra basically explodes. But it's actually no good hanging out there in the Russian winter. So you want to come back and have, a nice Australian summer. But basically then you see like, oh, I really like those Russian mosquitoes, and off you go again. And they breed up there. As a matter of fact, we have two different types of birds in Australia, which frequent our shores. Some of them are migratory. I know it's a really bad joke to be or not to be. And some of them are basically resident. Although you kind of have to ask, oh, please explain. But never mind. And essentially, it's that group which goes back and forth. There's a few really odd ones. I mean, one goes to New Zealand. It's a mystery. I mean, for any good Wallaby supporter, why to go to New Zealand, where the country is full of all black rugby players, is just inconceivable. But it happens. But there's only one, so we might forgive him. And this one actually goes back between Bali and Australia. And maybe he just copied that from all the Australians going to Bali, but not anymore. So, but those are the exceptions. Now, this is actually, once you look at the geography and the dimensions of it all, it really is quite astonishing. So that broad swath of area between the breeding areas in Siberia and Australia is called the East Australian Flyway. And we're talking about roughly 5 million shorebirds migrating every year, and up to 2 million make it to Australia. Now, here's some of the statistics, really. We're talking about 25,000 kilometer round trip. We're talking about non-stop flights up to 12,000 kilometers. We're talking about some birds have such an efficient oxygen consumption system that they can go and fly over Mount Everest at 9,000 meters. Yeah, we can't do that as humans. Think about, when you watch some of the mountain climbing documentaries, how inefficient our gas exchange system is. We're talking about reasonable speeds, and we talk about really internal clocks which regulate the timing of the anatomic and physiological changes. Now, we don't quite know why all that happens, and we can discuss a little bit more about that once we come to the ecology component. Some, hypothesis actually goes that, well, you know what? Everybody really likes to hang out in the tropics in summer, but essentially there's limited space. So some birds have to overshoot to go further south. The other one is basically saying, you know what? Actually, nobody likes Victoria at the moment, which I think is a total hysteria, but let's not get me started on that. Is basically that there might be too many parasites in the tropics. It might be too hot, or there might actually be more food when you go closer down to the temperate areas. Moreton Bay might be richer in invertebrates to pick from the shore than is, let's say, West Papua. We know all of that very, very well. In the old days, you actually had to fix little color bands on birds, and they had little numbers, and people tracked them all over the world. And nowadays, we just have satellite tags on them. But essentially, that's where they go. It really is quite astonishing. Different species use different, basically, flight routes. But what is really very concerning is that all use stopover sites, which is in this part of the world now, which has at the moment a bit of an, I would say, bullish foreign policy. And also is, of course, the largest growing economy in the world. And so what actually happens is essentially many of the important wetlands and staging sites are being lost. And so shorebird numbers, to protect them, depend both on the summer habitat, and it depends on the winter habitat, but also on the staging sites in between. Now here's something cool. I couldn't really, get a high resolution picture of a bird when they are gaining weight in preparation for the flight. But essentially, this is quite a chubby little, turnstone here, and they actually feed so extensively that they, gain about 2 to 5% of weight per day. They can actually up to about 55% of the body mass can be pure fat, and then need those energy reserves. So when people actually say like, oh yeah, it doesn't really matter when we disturb birds on a mud flat, by having the dog or running the car close to it. Well, that's not quite true, because all they do here is basically fattening up for the migration. And if there's not enough energy, they die. And so when we actually say, oh, we just flush the birds, it can actually, if there's lots of flushes, lots of time, it can have detrimental impacts. Now here's the graphs, of course, and this is, over a space of 1 month, how basically the fat mass goes up. But you can simply do something like this, and this in the old days where people basically found their birds and you cut them up, and you see this fellow here, same species as an oyster catcher, or dunlin, I should say. No, it's not there. And now you can actually see how they actually deposit the fat, and then they're almost ready to go. They're also quite clever. Even small birds, particularly in Europe, actually migrate long distances. And what they do is that they have some sort of really amazing, nocturnal hibernation. Only, essentially, they fly all day and then they sit, and then they fly all day. And while they sit, normally we actually slow our metabolism down as well when you go to bed and have a blanket over your head. But they do it really in a very, very traumatic fashion. There's, of course, much debate and much research how birds actually manage to achieve that. And, the one thing which actually is really quite amazing, when you do your yacht navigation, or you go particularly on long distance flights, I mean, I basically used to go overseas about 4 or 5 times a year. It's quite challenging now under COVID, and the airplanes don't really fly straight routes. They basically fly up, like in a, I would say, in a sort of twisted way. And the reason for that is the Earth is basically less voluminous near the poles. So sometimes the most direct route is not the shortest one. So you want to actually cut down to the poles and then come up again. It's called the Great Circular routes. They can also compensate for wind drift. We know that they have a magnetic sense. They can use the magnetic fields of the Earth. They use the position of the sun and the stars. And birds can detect polarized light. They even can remember landmarks. And here's the really cool thing I told you in the previous recording, that they can use infrasound and possibly also smell. And that birds have a much better developed sense of smell than we have assumed for many, many decades is actually something which has come to light more or less recently. We don't really have to watch this. Another thing about birds, let's try and get that back again, is watch this fella here. Now, we notice 2 things. Of course, owls are the show pony, I should say, of people filming for the amazing ability to have to rotate the head. And it's all for basically getting the visual field to the object they're interested in or want to examine. But birds in general have amazing eyes. As a matter of fact, they have a double focusing mechanism. One mechanism changes the curvature of the cornea and one of the lens. We only basically change the shape of the lens and the position. So that actually allows, for instance, a bird of prey to keep a target in focus very, very rapidly, almost instantaneously, while hunting it at about 200 or 300 kilometers an hour. Now, but not all birds are really that sharply focused. Here is another one. And I always, every zoology textbook and every lecture I always saw had the American woodcock in it. Sorry for that. Mostly because, maybe they're quite abundant in the States. I did my postdoc there. But also they have their eyes, which are very, very widely set back. And of course, it's very different to an owl or a raptor, which have their eyes just like us in the front of the head, because they rely on depth perception and on binocular vision. Whereas those guys, they literally sit on the ground and think, oh my God, I hope there isn't a raptor like an owl or a hawk or an eagle or a buzzard coming down on me. So what they want to do is they want to scan their surrounds all the time. Unless, of course, and that's why they have their eyes, set at the side. But they also have quite a funky move. I quite love that. And of course, if you actually think we are so specialized as humans, you think about all the dancing rituals we have only designed really for one purpose. So, the woodcock also has it. And so what we actually have in birds, we have an astonishing match between the life habits, the feeding habits, and the arrangement of the eyes. In a species like a pigeon or the woodcock apparently can actually see to the back, which is very, very cool, because the eyes are so far back and on the side. What you actually want, if you actually feed on the ground and you are easy prey for one of those, you want to essentially scan your horizon all the time. But it's probably not very, very important for you to have extremely accurate binocular vision with depth perception, because you pick up grains or little worms. This fellow, on the other hand, he basically needs all his perception to be very, very accurate in terms of three-dimensional pickup, and also in terms of rapid focusing. And that's why the eyes are actually looking forward. So the field of view and the balance between binocular vision and monocular vision is really well displayed in birds. The greater the overlap of the field of view is of the two eyes, the greater the depth perception. The less it is, the bigger the surroundings you can basically see. And this is why an owl goes like this, because the eyes are literally right in the front. But it actually has amazing eyesight and even better hearing. And it actually turns its head mostly to actually pick up sound. Now, those are the amazing facts about birds in a very, very short time, because we only really got 2 hours to talk about vertebrates, which is kind of really curious. But there will be lots more of those in the coming semesters, which we're going to talk to you about, various aspects about animal ecology. And I think, it is 5:10, which basically means I'm off for a gin and tonic, just like my little oyster catcher friend here in Tiva. Right. What we actually do during the lectures is, during the official lecture time, I think from 6 to 8, everybody can log in, and then we have a question and answer session. So looking forward to that. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend. It's going to be a glorious one. And I see you next week. But thank you very much. Cheerio.